A lighthouse hides a dark secret. A murderer lives here. The thing I keep coming back to, the detail I can't seem to file away and leave alone, is that he made coffee first. Not because making coffee is strange. People make coffee. It's the most ordinary thing in the world, but we'd been awake for going on 19 hours at that point. And the Coast Guard tender was already 40 minutes out. And Marcus, who had spent the better part of a week telling me that in situations like that one, you don't waste a single motion. Marcus walked back into the watchroom, filled the kettle, and stood there waiting for it to boil, like we had all the time in the world, like there was no particular reason to hurry. I asked him if he was all right. He said yes, absolutely. Why wouldn't he be? And I didn't have a good answer to that. So I watched him make the coffee. That was the last normal conversation we had. I want to be careful about how I tell this, because the version that comes out when I don't think about it too hard sounds either like I'm exaggerating or like I lost my mind somewhere out on that rock. And neither of those things is true. What happened out there was real. I was present for most of it, and I understood less of it than I wanted to. And I still understand less of it than I'm comfortable with. But I remember it clearly. That's the part that doesn't leave you, not the fear. Fear fades, and it should. That's what it's for. What stays is the clarity, the sharpness of everything, the smell of that coffee, the sound of the kettle. So let me go back to the beginning and try to do this properly. My name is not important for any of this. But for the sake of something to call me, you can use the name I went by out there, which was Callum. That's my middle name. I started using it professionally in my late 20s for reasons that have nothing to do with this story. And by the time I took the posting at Carrowmore Point, it was the name on all my paperwork. So that's the one that matters. I'm a heritage infrastructure specialist. That title sounds more impressive than it is. What it means practically is that I work for a consultancy that is contracted by various government bodies, cultural trusts, and occasionally private estates to assess and document structures of historical significance, specifically structures that are either at risk of deterioration or have recently come into new ownership or management frameworks. Lighthouses are about a third of my caseload. Old rail infrastructure, decommissioned military buildings, canal architecture, those take up the rest. It's quiet work, methodical. I spend a lot of time in buildings that most people never get to enter. And I produce reports that most people never read. And I find the whole thing genuinely satisfying in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who doesn't do something similar. Carrowmore Point Lighthouse is on a tidal island off the South Donegal coast. Not a true island. At low tide, you can walk across a long, flat causeway of packed sand and broken shell, about 600 meters from the mainland shore. At high tide, and especially in bad weather, the causeway disappears entirely under 2 or 3 feet of water, and you're effectively cut off. The lighthouse itself was decommissioned in 1987 and had been managed since then by a succession of caretaker arrangements, first a local heritage society, then a joint coastal trust, then a private individual who'd purchased the leasehold in the mid-2000s and done some renovation work before losing interest and handing it back to the trust. By the time I was sent out there, it had been sitting more or less unoccupied for about 18 months. The brief was straightforward. 3 weeks on site, full structural survey of the tower and associated outbuildings, photographic record, assessment of any deterioration since the last survey, which had been conducted 4 years prior. Standard stuff. My firm had been doing this kind of commission for the trust for years, and Carrowmore was by all accounts an easy one. Good condition relative to its age, no serious damp issues, accessible during most weather windows. What wasn't in my brief, and what I found out on the morning of my arrival at the mainland staging point, was that there was a second person on the posting. His name was Marcus Greevy. He was, depending on how you counted it, either very experienced or extremely experienced. He'd been doing lighthouse work specifically for close to 20 years, started as a volunteer with a maritime heritage group in his 30s, trained properly after that, and had since built a reputation as one of the people you called when a posting was isolated enough or technically complex enough that you wanted someone who'd seen most things. He was in his mid-50s when I met him, lean, unhurried in his movements, with a particular kind of quietness that belongs to people who have spent a lot of time in small spaces, with only themselves for company. Not unfriendly, just economical. He didn't waste words, and in the first few hours I was around him, I got the distinct impression that he was evaluating me without appearing to do so. We crossed to the island together on a clear Tuesday morning in early October. The causeway was passable, tide was well out, and we went on foot with gear loaded into 2 waterproof bags each. I remember the sky was an extraordinarily clean pale blue, and the light on the water was the kind of light that makes you feel like everything is going to be fine. Which I mention only because it's funny now, in a very quiet way, how light like that works on you. The lighthouse was everything the report had said it was. Solid granite, a roughly hexagonal footprint. The main tower was about 28 meters, not enormous by lighthouse standards, but well proportioned. And the attached keeper's cottage, 2 stories, 3 rooms upstairs. 2 down was in better shape than I'd expected. Someone had relayed the roof maybe a decade back. The windows were intact. The ground floor smelled like cold stone and old oil, and something underneath that I couldn't identify immediately, something almost sweet, like dry grass, or like the inside of an old wooden chest. Marcus walked through every room of the cottage before he said anything. I did the same, independently, making my preliminary notes. When we met back in the main ground floor room, which had a cast iron range, a deal table, 4 chairs, and a set of shelves built into the alcove beside the chimney breast, he put down his bag and told me there was a list. A list, I said. He opened the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper. Not a printout. Handwritten, in a small, neat script that I assumed was his, until I looked more closely and then realized it wasn't. The paper was older than it looked, and the handwriting had a slightly old-fashioned quality to it, a particular way of forming certain letters that you don't see much now. He put it on the table between us and told me to read it. It had 9 items. I'll give you the ones that mattered. Don't go up the tower after dark. Don't leave the kitchen door open overnight. Don't answer if someone calls your name from outside after the tide comes in. Don't use the lamp room. Don't enter it. If you find it open, close it and come back downstairs. If anything in the cottage stops working the range, the generator, any light, wait until morning to investigate. If you see someone on the causeway when the tide is in, don't go out to them. I read it twice. Then I looked at Marcus, who was watching me with an expression that was entirely neutral. I asked him where it came from. He said it had been left here by the previous permanent caretaker, a man named Doyle, who'd lived on the island seasonally for about 6 years as part of the earlier heritage arrangement. Doyle had departed. Marcus used that word, departed, and I remember thinking it was a slightly odd choice around 4 years ago. And the list had been found in the cottage during the survey that preceded my assignment. It had been passed along through the trust's records without, Marcus said, anyone having done very much about it. I asked Marcus if he thought the list was serious. He considered this for a moment. He said he thought Doyle had been serious when he wrote it. Whether the things on the list were serious independently of Doyle's state of mind, that, he said, was what they were here to find out. I appreciated that answer at the time. It seemed like the right kind of epistemically honest response from someone who'd been in odd buildings long enough to develop a sensible framework for oddness. Not dismissive, not credulous, just measured. I should have paid more attention to the fact that he folded the list and put it back in his jacket pocket rather than leaving it on the table. We divided the work the way you'd expect. I handled the structural assessment, the tower, the outbuildings, the condition of the stonework, the drainage, the mechanisms in the service room below the lamp room. Marcus was there in a more general caretaking and site management capacity, which in practice meant he managed the generator, kept the range going, handled communications with the mainland, and generally maintained the kind of daily operational functioning that lets a survey proceed without interruption. He was also, I understood without it being stated explicitly, the person with the institutional memory for the site. He'd been here before, not recently, but once, years back, as part of a different assessment. He knew the building's character in the way that only time gives you. The first week was extremely ordinary. We fell into a routine almost immediately, the way people do when they're task-oriented and the environment doesn't offer much distraction. Up at 7, breakfast. Work until early afternoon, lunch. Work until the lights started going, which in October on that latitude happened earlier than I always expect. Back to the cottage, dinner, a couple of hours of note writing or reading, or, in Marcus's case, something that looked like correspondence. He wrote actual letters, by hand, which seemed fitting given everything. Lights out by 10. The tower was interesting. They usually are. There's a specific quality to the interior of a lighthouse that has nothing to do with the paranormal. It's purely geometric. The spiral stair, the narrowing of perspective as you ascend, the way sound behaves against curved stone walls. It creates a mild but persistent sense of spatial unreality, like your depth perception is slightly miscalibrated. You get used to it, but it takes a day or two. The service room below the lamp room was full of equipment I'd expected to find, and some I hadn't. There were still maintenance records from the operational period, stacked in a metal cabinet in oilskin folders. The most recent entries, from 1987. I spent most of the second and third days in there, cataloging. Marcus came up once to check on me, looked around the room with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then went back down without much comment. The lamp room itself was locked. This wasn't unusual. Lamp rooms in decommissioned lighthouses are often secured, either because the mechanism is fragile, or because the trust or managing body wants to limit access for insurance purposes. I had the key. It was on the ring that came with my access documentation. But the list had said not to enter it. I thought about this more than I probably should have. And I landed, at the end of the first week, on a pragmatic middle position. I didn't need to go into the lamp room for the structural portion of my survey. The glass and mechanism assessment was technically outside my primary brief. So I left it, not because the list told me to, because I didn't need to, yet. That distinction felt important to me at the time. It stopped feeling important later. The first thing I noticed that wasn't right happened on the 8th night. I'd been having some difficulty sleeping. The range made sounds as it cooled. And the island had a quality of stillness at night that was different from any stillness I'd encountered elsewhere. Not silence exactly. The sea was always there, and the wind was usually there. But there was a layer underneath those sounds that had a quality I'm going to describe as density. Like the quiet was something with weight to it, rather than just an absence of noise. I was lying awake around 2 in the morning, not anxious, just awake, when I heard footsteps on the floor above me. Marcus slept upstairs. I'd taken the downstairs room because I preferred ground level, and he'd had no preference. So footsteps above me were not, in themselves, alarming. People get up in the night. What was slightly odd was the rhythm. Not the rhythm of someone moving purposefully to the bathroom and back, more like someone pacing. A slow back and forth. The same short distance, maybe 4 or 5 steps in each direction. I lay still and listened to it for a while. It continued for maybe 20 minutes and then stopped. In the morning, I mentioned it to Marcus. In the way you mention things that you're 90% sure have a perfectly reasonable explanation. He was making breakfast, and he paused very slightly before answering, in a way that I noticed but chose not to press. He said he'd slept badly and probably moved around. He said old stone carried sound oddly, and I might have been hearing something from outside. Both of those things were plausible. I accepted them both. The pacing happened again the following night, and the night after that. On the 3rd night of it, I got up and went to the foot of the stairs. Not all the way up. I stood at the bottom and listened. The sound was clearer there. It was definitely footsteps, definitely measured, definitely pacing. And underneath the footsteps, there was something I hadn't been able to make out from my room, which was a low sound. Not words, not humming, more like the sound a person makes when they're engaged in something that requires concentration, a continuous, toneless exhalation. Not breathing, something more deliberate than breathing. I stood there for about 5 minutes. Then I went back to bed. I want to be careful not to sensationalize that moment, because at the time, it didn't feel frightening. It felt strange and slightly intrusive, the way it feels when you become aware of something about a person you're living with that they haven't chosen to share with you, a private behavior. I felt like I'd intruded on something, not like something had intruded on me. The next morning, Marcus seemed entirely himself. Alert, methodical, competent. He'd gone up the tower ahead of me to check on something in the service room, and had a detailed observation about the condition of one of the iron support brackets that was genuinely useful for my report. He made good coffee. He was good company in the quiet, undemanding way he usually was. I almost asked him about the pacing, and then didn't. I think about that a lot. The breach happened on the 11th day, And I want to explain it properly because the explanation matters, and because anyone who's done extended field work in isolated locations will understand it immediately. I had been working on the exterior stonework assessment on the seaward face of the tower, which required scaffolding that I'd rigged on the second day, but hadn't been able to fully use because the wind had been consistently wrong. You can't work at height on the seaward face in anything over about 15 knots from that direction. The morning of the 11th day was perfect. Completely still, overcast in a way that was actually good for photography. And the tide was going to be well out until late afternoon. I had a clean, viable 5-hour window, and I needed it because I was slightly behind schedule. And the stonework data was critical. I was up the scaffold by 9, and I worked through to about 1:30, which ate through my packed lunch and my water and most of my concentration. By the time I came down, I was dehydrated and genuinely tired in the specific way that height work makes you tired, which is different from other kinds of physical tiredness. The light had shifted. The overcast had thickened into something more purposeful, and there was rain coming. You could feel it before you could see it. A dampening of the air quality, a particular gray flatness to the water. Marcus was on the mainland. This needs context. About every 4 or 5 days, one of us would cross to the mainland. The walk was easy enough at low tide to pick up supplies, to have proper phone signal for necessary calls, and frankly just to have an hour or two in a space that wasn't made of granite. We alternated. It was Marcus's turn, and he'd left that morning at 8, and I'd expected him back by early afternoon. But he'd mentioned the possibility of needing to make a stop at the Trust's local liaison office. And now with rain incoming, I thought it was likely he'd waited out the weather before crossing back. Which meant I was alone, which was fine. I'd been alone on site before, and alone on an island before. Not a problem. But I was very thirsty, and I'd left my second water bottle inside, and I was too tired to wait on the scaffold any longer. And I needed to get inside before the rain came. So I climbed down, packed the camera gear, and went around to the cottage's kitchen door, which I'd left open. Not wide open. I'd left it standing an inch or so ajar. The kitchen got good light in the mornings, and I'd pushed it open when I went to get my lunch things, and I hadn't closed it all the way. And then I'd gone back up the scaffold, and I hadn't thought about it. The list said, don't leave the kitchen door open overnight. It was not overnight. It was 4 in the afternoon. And I'd left it by accident, not by choice. And the difference felt meaningful when I was standing there looking at it. I pushed the door fully open and went inside. The kitchen was cold. Not cold in the way of a room that's been without the range for a while. I'd kept the range going. And it was still radiating. But cold in the way of a room that has been ventilated by something other than the door I'd left ajar. A deeper cold. The kind that's in the walls rather than in the air. And there was a smell, very faint, almost at the edge of perception. Wet stone, and something else. Not the sweet, dry grass smell I'd noticed on the first day, but something older than that. Something like waterlogged wood. Like a thing that's been submerged and hasn't dried properly. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looked around the kitchen. Everything was where I'd left it. The 2 mugs from breakfast, the bread on the shelf, the notebooks stacked on the corner of the table, the chairs exactly where they'd been. I drank 2 full glasses of water standing at the sink, got my waterproof from the hook beside the door. closed the kitchen door, and latched it. That was all. I went and did 3 hours of interior work in the service room and didn't think about it much. The rain came in around 6 and went through most of the night. Marcus came back just before 7 in the evening, slightly damp, carrying supplies, reporting nothing of interest from the mainland, except that the trust liaison had changed offices and had taken up an inexplicable enthusiasm for herbal tea. We had dinner. We talked about the stonework data I'd collected and about a discrepancy in the original construction records versus the current dimensions of the service room that I found interesting. He thought it was probably a recording error in the originals. I wasn't sure. We went to bed at the usual time. I slept until about 3. And then I was awake, and the pacing had stopped or had never started. And the cottage was completely quiet. And I was lying in the dark with the absolute, unargued knowledge that there was something in the room with me. I am not a person who has intuitions of that kind. I don't say this to establish any kind of skeptical credibility or to imply that people who do have such intuitions are wrong about them. I'm saying it because it's relevant. In my ordinary life, in any building I've ever worked in, I've not experienced the specific sensation of human presence without a corresponding human cause. It's not something I'd put in my professional vocabulary, but it was there. The room was dark, no light from outside, overcast still, and the room was quiet. And something was in it that had not been there when I fell asleep. I did not move. This was not a decision. My body simply held still, the way it does sometimes in the first seconds of waking, when you can't yet locate yourself in space. And while I held still, I tried to identify what I was actually perceiving. Because I'm aware that the mind in the dark is its own kind of instrument with its own particular calibration errors. What I could detect was a very slight displacement of the air near the foot of my bed. Not a draft, not directional in the way a draft would be. More like the change in air pressure that occurs when something occupies space that was previously unoccupied. And a sound that was less a sound than the boundary of a sound, the edge of something below what I could actually hear, a subsonic quality, like standing too close to a large piece of old machinery that isn't running but still carries the memory of vibration. I lay still for a long time. At some point it was gone. I don't know exactly when. I hadn't moved, and nothing dramatic had happened. And then the room felt like a room again, and I was lying in the dark by myself. In the morning, I was going to tell Marcus. That was what I decided before I went back to sleep. I was going to tell him clearly and without editorializing that I had experienced something specific and wanted his perspective on it. That was the right thing to do. We were two professionals on a site, and this was relevant site information. What happened instead was that I woke to the sound of him in the kitchen, making breakfast, and I came through and he looked at me and said I looked like I'd had a poor night. And I said I'd slept badly, and I let the moment pass. I've thought about why I did that, and I still don't entirely know. Partly inertia, the daylight, has a way of making the nighttime feel like a different country, somewhere that the rules of currency and language don't quite transfer. Partly something else that I'm less comfortable naming, which is that I didn't want to say it out loud and have it stay said. While it was only inside me, it was still a private thing, still manageable. I told myself I'd say something if it happened again. The list was on the table. Marcus had taken it out of his pocket at some point and left it there, and I sat across from it while I ate and read it again. Properly this time. The way you read a thing when the words have acquired a different weight than they had before. If you see someone on the causeway when the tide is in, don't go out to them. I thought about that one for the first time. The others had a quality that could be explained by practical or structural concerns. Don't use the generator equipment at night in case you can't see what you're doing. Don't leave the door open in case of animals or weather damage. But that one didn't. That one was specific in a way that implied specificity of experience. Whoever wrote it had seen someone. On the causeway when the tide was in, when the crossing wasn't possible. I looked at the paper more closely. The handwriting was very small and very even, and there was a slight pressure variation in some of the letters, as though the pen had been held more tightly in certain places. The entries about the kitchen door and the tower after dark had been written with the same pressure throughout, consistent. The entry about the causeway had been written harder. The person who wrote it had been leaning into the pen. I asked Marcus about Doyle that morning while we were getting our gear together. Not about the list, about the man himself. Marcus said Doyle had come to the posting in his 50s, after a long career as a harbor master in a small port on the Clare coast. He'd lived here seasonally for 6 years. He'd been, by all accounts Marcus had encountered, meticulous, capable, and thorough, the kind of caretaker who documented everything, maintained everything, left things in better condition than he found them. He'd left the posting without notice, which was unusual. No formal resignation. He'd simply stopped responding to correspondence, and then the trust had sent someone to check on the island and found it empty and in good order. The list was taped to the inside of the kitchen cupboard. His personal belongings were gone. I asked if anyone knew where he'd gone. Marcus said the trust had made inquiries and understood that he was alive and well, and living with family somewhere in the Midlands. He hadn't responded to any direct contact. Living with family, I said. That's a specific phrase. Either Marcus knew something more than that, or the trust had a report that used that wording. And something about the precision of it, the way it closed off further inquiry, made me want to ask another question. But Marcus had moved on to talking about the tide schedule for the day, and the moment passed. The second thing that was wrong happened 4 nights later, which puts us at the 15th night on the island. I want to be precise about what happened, because the imprecision of my original experience of it is part of what made it as disturbing as it was. I was in the service room. It was late afternoon, going towards 6, and the light through the slit windows on the seaward side was going orange and horizontal. I'd been cataloging the instrument mounts, which was fiddly work requiring a lot of close attention. And I'd been at it for about 3 hours. And I was reaching the end of my concentration for the day. And I heard Marcus call my name. He called from downstairs, just my name, Callum, in the way you call up a stairwell when you want to know if someone's there. Easy, ordinary tone. 1 word. I said yes, be down in a minute, and went on cataloging for another 5 minutes or so. And then I came down the spiral stair and went through the service room door into the base of the tower and across to the cottage. Marcus was in the main room, writing. He'd been there, he said, for the last hour. Hadn't called me. Why would he call me? He had no need of anything from me. I said, "You didn't call up the stairs for me just now." He looked at me steadily. He said, No. And his face, this is the part I keep returning to. His face did something that I'd only seen it do once before, which was the morning after I'd told him I'd slept badly. A very slight movement around the eyes. Not alarm, not quite. Something more like the controlled suppression of something that would have been alarm in a person less practiced at not showing it. He told me to sit down. He put the kettle on, and while it was heating he told me what he knew, which was more than he'd told me before. And I think he knew it was time. And I think the sound of my name from the stairwell had decided it for him. He said that Carrowmore Point had an unusual history, even by the standards of isolated lighthouse postings, which are as a category not short on unusual histories. There had been 5 keepers in the period from 1901 to 1952, which was normal. 4 of them had served conventional terms and left in conventional ways. The 5th, a man named Brennan, who'd been posted here from 1931 to 1938, had not. Brennan had filed detailed logs for the first 4 years of his posting. The logs were in the Trust's archive, and Marcus had read them. They were, he said, the logs of a man doing his job correctly, and also the logs of a man who was hearing something in the tower that was not the wind, and not the mechanism, and not as any acoustic property of the building that could be identified or explained. Brennan hadn't been a credulous man. His logs were technical and precise. The notations about the sounds were in the same register as the notations about the weather. And the beam maintenance, observational, factual, dated. He described a sound that he called a resonance in the lamp room, occurring at irregular intervals, but always after midnight, and always when the tide was fully in. He described it as tonal, structured. He wrote on the 14th of March, 1934, that the resonance had, for the first time, taken on a quality that he recognized, without being able to say what it was that he recognized in it. After 1935, the logs changed in character. They became less detailed, more sparse, and then in the final 2 years before Brennan's departure, they became almost purely logistical weather data, maintenance records, supply inventories. The personal observations stopped. He'd apparently made a decision about what to write down and what not to. He left in 1938, voluntarily, with notice, in good standing. He went back to his family in County Mayo. He never worked at sea or with maritime infrastructure again, in any capacity. Marcus put the tea on the table and sat down. He said he didn't know what Brennan had heard. He said he didn't know what Doyle had written on that list based on, though he had a good idea of the general shape of it. He said that in his experience, and this was the most personal thing I ever heard him say about himself in those 3 weeks, in his experience, these places had a character, like people had a character. Most lighthouse postings had a benign character, even the isolated ones, even the ones with history. Carrowmore's character was different. He hadn't been able to name it the first time he'd visited, years ago, and he still couldn't name it now. But he'd felt it when they arrived, and he thought I'd started to feel it, and he thought it was time we were both honest about that. I asked him about the lamp room. He said, don't. Just that, don't. And I want to be clear that in that moment, sitting across from Marcus in the kitchen of that cottage with the last of the October light going gray outside the window, that single word was the most frightening thing that had happened to me on the island. Not the presence in my room, not the voice, The fact that Marcus, who had been calm about everything, who had been measured and unfrightened and professionally competent in every moment I'd observed him, said don't, with an expression behind it that I can only describe as closed. Like a door that's been shut on something for a long time and shut firmly and is not going to be discussed. We ate dinner. We talked about other things. I went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time before I slept. And when I slept without disturbance, for the first time in several nights. The following days, I finished the exterior work and most of the interior documentation. I had the data I needed for everything except the lamp room. And I drafted a note for the report explaining that the lamp room assessment had been deferred pending guidance from the trust about access protocols, which was true in a technical sense and told no one anything real. Marcus seemed to approve of this framing without commenting on it. On the 18th day, the pacing stopped. That's how I noticed it by absence. I'd become so habituated to the sound from upstairs that I'd stopped registering it consciously. And its absence woke me at some point in the early morning in the way that silence sometimes does. I lay still and listened, and the cottage was absolutely quiet. And after a few minutes, I went back to sleep. In the morning, Marcus was not in the kitchen. This was not unusual in itself. He was sometimes up before me and already at some external task. But the range was out properly out, banked down overnight and not relayed, which was never something he neglected. And his boots were by the kitchen door, which they shouldn't have been if he'd gone outside. I checked the main room. Empty. I went to the foot of the stairs. I called up. No answer. I went upstairs. His room was... I need to find the right word for this. It was orderly. That's the word. Not abandoned in any dramatic sense. The bed was made, which again was consistent with his habits. His personal items were arranged as they usually were. His correspondence, his notebooks, his reading material, all there. His outdoor jacket was on the hook on the back of the door. His indoor jacket, the one with the list in the inside pocket, was gone. I went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a while, thinking. I was trying to be methodical about this. I went through the cottage again, every room. I checked the outhouse, the fuel store, the small stone structure behind the cottage that had once been a secondary equipment room and was now used for dry storage. I walked around the exterior of the tower. I stood at the base of the tower door and looked up the spiral stair to where it disappeared into shadow around the third curve. Then I looked at the time. Tide was 2 hours from its lowest point. In 2 hours, I could cross to the mainland and make contact with the trust. That was the practical option. I should have taken it. What I did instead, and I'm not going to dress this up as anything other than what it was, which was a failure of the judgment I'd been priding myself on, was go up the tower. Not all the way. I told myself, not all the way. I went to the service room and checked it, which was empty and unchanged. I stood outside the door of the lamp room. I didn't open it. I stood there for maybe 3 minutes, my hand not quite on the handle, listening. The lamp room was silent. I went back down. I spent 2 hours in the cottage writing up notes, which was the only thing that kept me from an anxiety that would have been useless. And when the tide was right, I crossed to the mainland, called the trust, filed an emergency absence report for Marcus, and sat in the car with the heater running until the Coast Guard tender arrived. They searched the island. They searched the water around it. They searched the interior of the lighthouse, including, I learned later, the lamp room. They found nothing. No sign of any incident, no sign of Marcus. His outdoor clothing and personal documents were on the island. His body was not. There was a period of formal inquiry, as there would be in any case of unexplained disappearance on a managed heritage site. I gave a statement that was accurate in all the ways that statements are required to be accurate. I described the evening before the disappearance. I described finding the range-out and his boots by the door. I described searching the cottage and the exterior. I did not describe the voice from the stairwell. I did not describe the presence in my room. I did not describe the conversation we'd had about Brennan and the list. I don't know if this makes me complicit in something, and I've thought about it enough times at enough different hours of the day that I've stopped expecting to reach a conclusion. The trust offered to send another specialist to complete the assessment. I told them I could finish it. I went back. Not because of professional obligation, though I used that as the surface reason. Because I needed to understand what I had 3 weeks of proximity to. And because I thought the lamp room was the answer. And because the lamp room was something I'd been told not to enter, and I was going to make that decision for myself. I crossed in the morning, at low tide, alone. The weather was good. The cottage was exactly as we'd left it, his boots still by the door, my notes still on the table. I made the range, boiled water, had tea. Then I went up the tower, and I unlocked the lamp room. I want to be honest about what I found there, which means being honest about the gap between what I expected and what I experienced. I expected the lamp room to feel wrong in a way I'd be able to describe. I expected something verifiable, evidence of, I don't know, something. Brennan's resonance, the source of the voice, the reason for every rule on the list. What I found was a lamp room. The great glass lens assembly, still intact, its panels catching the morning light and throwing it in long arcs across the curved walls. The mechanism housing below it disused, a fine layer of dust on every surface. The narrow gallery window looking out over the sea, which at that hour and in that light was the particular shade of gray-green that you can almost feel against your skin. It was cold. Colder than the service room below it, which should not be possible in a room with more glazing, but it was. And it smelled like the cottage kitchen had smelled on the afternoon I'd left the door open, that deep, submerged wood smell, waterlogged and old, and there in the back of your sinuses before you can stop it. I stood in the center of the lamp room floor, and I turned around slowly, and I looked at everything. And then I did something that I hadn't planned, which was that I spoke out loud in that room. I don't know what I intended. An experiment, maybe, or something more than that. Something less professional and more human. I said Marcus's name. The sound of my own voice in that room was wrong in a way I cannot explain technically. It didn't echo in the way it should have, given the glass and the stone and the shape of the space. It went out, and then it came back, not as an echo, which has a delay, but immediately, like something had held it for a fraction of a second, and then returned it. Not an echo, a repetition. I stood very still, from somewhere below the lamp room, from the spiral stair, or from the base of the tower, or from somewhere that was neither of those things, I heard footsteps, measured. A short distance, back and forth. 4 steps, 5 steps back. The same distance. The same rhythm I'd been hearing through the ceiling of my room for 2 weeks. I did not go to the door of the lamp room and look out at the stairwell. I turned to face the lens assembly, which was the furthest point in the room from the door, and I stood there, with my back to whatever was using the stairs. And I breathed, and I waited for it to stop. It stopped after perhaps 4 minutes. I went down the stairs without looking at anything I didn't need to look at, crossed through the base of the tower, went back to the cottage, closed the door, and packed my remaining equipment. I completed the survey at the table that afternoon, from my notes. I didn't go back up the tower. I filed my report 2 weeks later. It was thorough and precise, and it said nothing about any of this. Marcus has not been found. I check occasionally, not because I expect a different result, but because he deserves someone to keep looking. The trust has, as of the last information I have, engaged a new permanent caretaker for Carrowmore Point. I don't know who they are. I don't know what orientation they received or what documents they were given. I have thought more than once about writing to the trust liaison to ask whether the list, Doyle's list, the handwritten one that Marcus kept in his inside jacket pocket, whether that list has been preserved and passed on to whoever is living there now. I haven't sent that letter. I tell myself it's because I don't know how to explain the context. Which is true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that the list was in Marcus's jacket. The inside jacket. The one that went with him wherever he went. And Marcus's indoor jacket was the one thing in that room that wasn't there when I searched it. I think about that most mornings. Just for a moment before the day starts properly. The list going with him, the particular care he took of it, the way he kept it close, folded in the same pocket, whether that was instinct or intention, whether he knew, for some time before the 18th night, that it was going to matter where that piece of paper was, whether the list was meant for the next person all along, and whether the next person knows what they're holding.